Through Chekhov's Eyes. Dispatched 16th of November, 1942. For many days and nights, those all-seeing eyes keep watch over the city from the 5th floor of a ruined apartment block. They see the street, the square, dozens of buildings with their crumbling floors and ceilings, empty, lifeless boxes filled with a deceptive silence. Those round hazel eyes see the distant hills pitted with German dugouts. Sometimes it's so quiet, you can hear the slightest noise in the block where Germans are sitting. Small pieces of plaster falling, snatches of German conversation, the creaking of jackboots. At other times, the bombing and firing are so noisy that you have to lean over and shout in your comrade's ear. Even if you shout at the top of your voice, he'll shrug his shoulders as if to say, "I can't hear you." Anatoly Chekhov has just turned 19, son of chemical workers, a bright, intelligent lad with a warm heart and 100 different talents, who loves books and is keen on geography, dreams of distant voyages, and is much loved by comrades and neighbours. This young fellow has known the darker side of life from the age of 10. His father was a drunk who ill-treated them. A couple of years before the war, he deserted them altogether. Anatoly Chekhov had to quit school, where he got top marks in every subject, and went to work at a Kazan factory. He became indispensable and respected by all. On the 29th of March, 1942, his call-up papers arrived, and when he reported for duty, he requested to be sent to a sniper school. "I never as much as fired at a living thing as a child, even from a catapult. I could never hurt a living creature," he told me. "At the sniper school, I did quite well, getting top marks in all subjects. Yet at my very first target shooting test, I was awful. I scored 9 out of a possible 50. The lieutenant told me, 'You'll never make a sniper.'" Yet Chekhov didn't give up. Instead, he studied well into the night after his daily stint, reading up theory and teaching himself target shooting. He proved the lieutenant wrong. At the moving target, Chekhov hit the small target right on the button with all 3 bullets. He graduated from the sniper school with honours and at once asked to be sent to the front. "I want to become the sort of man who destroys the enemy with his own hands," he once told me. While on the march, he trained himself to measure distances without the aid of optical sights. He tried to guess the distance to a certain tree and would then pace it out. For him, the most idyllic landscape became nothing but a combination of landmarks: birches, briar bushes, windmills, places behind which the enemy might hide. From the very first, he did not see the battle as a chaos of fire and noise. He learned to work out what exactly the enemy was up to. People often talk of bravery at the front. As often as not, the talk turns into heated debate. Some say bravery is a sort of oblivion that comes in battle. Others say, with just as much conviction, that they are fearful and have to force themselves to advance in the face of death. Yet others claim they are brave simply because they have convinced themselves they won't ever die. At the root of most courage and contempt for death is a sense of duty, a hatred of the enemy, a desire to avenge the awful disasters invasion has brought the country. With Chekhov, I saw yet another variety of courage, the simplest, perhaps the most solidly reliable. He was by nature a complete stranger to the fear of death. He was scared of death no more than an eagle is scared of height. When he received his first assignment, it took him a long time to decide where to take up position, whether in the cellar or on the first floor or among a pile of bricks torn from a tall building wall by a high explosive bomb. Carefully and painstakingly, he examined the buildings in the advanced position of our defence. His keen eyes took in every detail: the seared ends of potted palms on the windowsills, the warped bits of tin that had been blown about by the hot breath of fire like pieces of paper, the black tarred cables stripped of their earth covering, the thick water mains, all the muscles and sinews of the city. Chekhov made a choice. He entered a tall building and climbed the almost undamaged staircase to the top. The front wall was gone, leaving a gap that provided a good view of the whole locality. The apartment blocks over the road where the Germans were entrenched, the broad street running to the left and behind, and some 700 metres away, the main square. All this was in German hands. Chekhov took up a position on the landing behind a sharp projection in the wall, keeping well within its shadow. He could therefore see without being seen. He rested his rifle on top of the iron railings and glanced down. Down the deserted street walked 2 German soldiers. They halted within 100 metres of where he was sitting. The young fellow looked at them for several minutes. He hesitated. That odd sense of indecision, familiar to almost all snipers before firing their first shot, took possession of him. It was soon nightfall. The blue sky turned a dark indigo. The lofty, fire-gutted buildings stood like silent grey corpses. The moon rose, round and clear. Its rays had neither warmth nor fragrance. The cold waxen light spread in a thin film over the dead city, over the hundreds of eyeless buildings, making the asphalt of streets and square gleam like ice. Chekhov recalled the books he'd read about the ruins of ancient cities, and an aching, bitter pain gripped his young heart. It seemed to be choking him. So great was the pain and his desire to see the city free again, alive and happy, to bring back the thousands of young girls waiting and shivering on the chill plains for passing cars to give them a lift. He thought of the little boys and girls who, with the gravity of old folk, had watched the troops marching towards Stalingrad. Old men muffled in shawls, grandmothers wearing their sons' overcoats on top of their jackets. A shadow flitted over the cornice. A big Persian cat with fluffy tail passed noiselessly by. She looked at Chekhov with eyes that burned with a blue flame. Somewhere, at the end of the street, a dog began to bark, then another, and a third. He caught a German voice lifted in anger. The crack of a shot, the anguished howl of a dog, and then again, that loud, angry, alarming barking of many dogs. Those were loyal watchdogs that stopped the Germans from roaming at night in the wrecked houses. Chekhov got to his feet, and picking his way carefully to avoid fragments of glass glittering brilliantly in the moonlight, made his way downstairs. His infantry section had taken up residence in the cellar. The sergeant was asleep on an old-fashioned nickel-plated bed, while the men lay on charred strips of silk eiderdown. Someone poured him a mug of tea. The kettle had just boiled, and the rim of the tin mug burned his lips. He sat on a pile of bricks, listening to a Red Armyman from the city talk about his life before cinema, beach, theatre. The elephant at the zoo had been killed in the bombing, the dance halls and the wonderful girls. As he listened, Chekhov still had before him a picture of the dead city beneath the light of the full moon. He recalled his own unhappy childhood. My father was always starting rows, and it was hard to study when he was around. I didn't have a corner of my own. That night, he realized fully for the first time the terrible evil the Germans had brought our land. Petty hardships and privations were nothing compared to the great national calamity, and his young heart burned with rage. The sergeant woke up. The nickel bed springs creaked as he shifted. Well, young Chekhov, how many Germans did you bag on your first night? Chekhov didn't answer. He was lost in thought. Suddenly he turned to the men who had recently returned from sentry duty and were about to wind up the gramophone. Don't play tonight, he said. Please. He rose before dawn next morning, pouring some water into his flask, putting a few slices of dry bread in his pocket. Chekhov climbed to his post, lay down on the cold stone floor, and commenced his vigil. The sun rose, bathed everything in light. Such was its vital force that even the miserable city seemed to smile a faint, wan smile. Under the protruding wall where Chekhov lay was there a cold grey shadow. A German carrying an enamel plate turned the corner. Later, Chekhov learned that the soldiers always came out with their pails at this time to fetch water for the officers to wash with. He turned the distance wheel, raising the crossed hairline of his sights. He shifted them 4 centimetres forward from the soldier's nose and fired. A black spot suddenly appeared beneath the soldier's cap. His head jerked backwards, and the pail fell with a clatter as he crashed sideways. Chekhov could not help trembling with excitement. A minute later, another German appeared round the corner with a pair of field glasses in his hands. Chekhov pressed the trigger. A third German was about to go over to the dead soldier with the pail, but he never made it. 3, said Chekhov, and stopped shaking. That day, Chekhov's eyes observed many things. He discovered which way the Germans went to their headquarters located behind the building diagonally across from his post. Soldiers were always running there with white report forms in their hands. He discovered by which route the Germans brought up ammunition to their machine gunners to the building opposite. He discovered the road by which they brought food and water. Around dinner time, the Germans opened up with heavy mortar fire, keeping it up for about 40 minutes, after which they shouted out in chorus, "Rus! Time for lunch!" Their mocking invitation drove Chekhov wild. There was something revolting about the Germans trying to make a joke amidst the tragic ruins of this tormented dead city. It offended his very soul. He was especially merciless in the lunch hour. He learned quickly to distinguish officers from men. The former wore short jackets, peaked caps and shoes, but no belts. He could tell the men by their boots, leather belts and trench caps. Sniper Chekhov wanted to stop the Germans walking tall about the city, stop them drinking fresh water or eating breakfast and lunch. By the end of the first day, Chekhov had spotted an officer, and it was immediately obvious that he was a big noise. He walked confidently along, sure of himself, and gunners came dashing out of all the buildings to salute him. Once more, Chekhov adjusted his sights. The officer shook his head, fell sideways, his shoes towards Chekhov. Chekhov made a mental note that it was easier to fire at someone running than at someone standing still. He could hit them straight in the head. In most cases, it is the flash of the discharge that gives the sniper away, so henceforth Chekhov always fired against the white wall background, keeping his rifle muzzle about 12 or 14 centimetres from the edge of the wall. Against a white background, a flash was invisible. He wanted only one thing now, to prevent Germans from walking upright in the city, press them to the ground, drive them into the very earth. And he achieved his aim. By the end of the first day, the Germans no longer walked, they ran. And by the end of the second day, they were crawling. No longer did the soldier venture out each morning to fetch water for the officer. The path leading to the drinking water became deserted. The Germans gave up drinking fresh water and had to make do with stale water from the tank. On the evening of the second day, as he pressed the trigger, Chekhov murmured, 17. That night the German submachine gunners went without their supper. Chekhov went downstairs. The men were eating their supper to the strains of Little Blue Headscarf from the gramophone. The Germans opened up withering fire with mortars, cannon, and heavy machine guns. The hungry submachine gunners roared loudest of all. But they no longer called Rus time to eat. By the 8th day, Chekhov controlled all the roads leading to the German-held buildings. But it was now time to change his position, for the Germans had stopped moving about and firing. He lay on the landing and looked with youthful eyes at the city laid waste by the Germans. The young man who wouldn't hurt a fly as a boy had been turned into a killer by the stern and sacred logic of patriotic war. He had become a merciless avenger.
Anatoly Chekhov would go on to claim 256 enemy soldiers before being badly wounded in 1944. Through Chekhov's Eyes was translated by Jim Reardon, read by Elliot Levy and produced by Mark Berman.